Jacob, good morning.
Hey, good morning.
Thank you for taking some time out for us today.
Yeah.
I want to start with the issue of Medicaid.
Yeah.
That might be the biggest issue in the state today. I want to know what your assessment is of how the transition to managed care has gone so far. Just an overall perspective on where we are with Medicaid under the new way of doing things.
Well, I think there's two issues with that. I think the one kind of preceded my time in the legislature, just coming in January, was whether that was the direction to go. I think from what I've gleaned and saw, even as a citizen before that, was that something had to be done. It was the largest growing portion of the state budget. It couldn't continue that way. I have friends who worked in the field, for the state and the counties, that said that there was a lot of restrictions of what they couldn't do, and a lot of waste and just unnecessary people. And so I think that something needed to be done. And so they made the choice, and I'm not going to question that, of going to the MCOs. I think the other issue is, what do you do going forward? And I think that we had some good steps this last year, where for the first time we passed, I think 3 times we passed it, and it was included in part of the negotiations going forward, that there are some oversights that they're going to be held accountable. They have to have timely payments, that it restricts some of their pre-approval requirements and some things like that. I think the big issue that you're running into, though, are some people that need care that are not getting that. And I think people need to understand that this is a little bit different than the way most government works. If you think of like the Department of Revenue, if they make a mistake, in 2 years from now they'll write you a check for $3,000 and make it good, that's fine. With healthcare, you can't fix it 2 years from now. Somebody could be dead by then. So that's why I think that there needs to be some sort of hybrid approach, whether you have oversight from the state or whether it goes back to more of a managed care sort of structure, but run by the state. But there needs to be some type of safety net where, if something isn't happening, somebody with the authority can step in and say, okay, we understand your structure and that you're trying to be efficient, you're trying to wean people off of care maybe they don't need, but if this person's about to die or this child is not receiving the care that they need, that somebody can step in a timely manner and make sure that happens. So I'm not ready to pull the plug on the system, but I think there's definitely things that the state can do to make sure that, and for the most part, you don't hear from people that the system isn't working, as much as there are a couple situations. I guess that's an example maybe where it's not working, but there's a couple situations where things are falling through the cracks.
But your approach is more, let's take what we have and improve on it and look at where problems exist and address those, as opposed to just throwing the whole system out the window and going back to how we did things.
Exactly, because from what I've heard from a friend of mine who works now for a managed care organization, she said that it wasn't working. The way it was before is maybe not the ideal situation that some people are remembering right now. So I think something had to be done. And obviously we've signed a contract, and a lot of things can't be done until that contract is up. But I think going forward, I would like to pull back a little bit, where at least there's some oversight, where if something's not happening, a certain type of care is being denied, that somebody from the state maybe has veto power. So I would like to see some type of reform to that system, and I would like to learn more about it. And as I'm knocking on doors, you hear from people who've had issues with it. So I think it's something that we need to study, and I think we as Republicans need to be open to reforming, and I think people are. We want to make sure that it works. And I think that that's something, sort of a different issue that I think people need to understand, is that Republicans and Democrats want to accomplish the same thing. We're so quickly to demonize, villainize the other side right now, that they don't care about kids, they want poor people to die. And I think people need to understand we both want to accomplish the same thing. We want high quality care for the people that need it and make sure that nobody falls through the cracks. There's just a disagreement maybe right now over how to do that.
That's a good transition to the next question, which is about education. That is, I would say, the #1 issue for your opponent. She talked extensively about education. She has a passion for education, spent her whole career in education. Feels the state of Iowa underfunds K-12 education. She'd like to see the funding at, say, a 4% or higher level, she said when she met with us. I think the state aid was 1% this past session. Do you feel that the state of Iowa underfunds K-12 public education, and were you an advocate for a larger percentage increase in state aid?
I think there's a lot of things that go into that. Obviously, one is a low number, and obviously like to see that higher than that in the future. I think for this year, because we had a series of de-appropriations for a couple years before I got there, and a small one this year, there was some apprehension on both sides of the aisle that we don't want to be in a situation where we have to de-appropriate. So I think people were being small c conservative a little bit more so. I think they felt like 1% was adequate, and in the sense was the most that we could do at the time. I do think now with the revenue projections, or the numbers now higher than the projections, that next year we need to make up for that. But if you look at Iowa versus other states, since Republicans took over in 2011, we've increased funding $765 million. We've increased funding more so than any other, percentage-wise, more so than any other state except for 2 or 3 in the country. So I think you had a situation where everybody in the country was having some issues with funding, and Iowa, I think, was managed much better than most, and in a situation where we were able to help hold education harmless for the most part.
What time frame was that again?
Since Republicans took control of the Iowa House in 2011, that you saw, I believe it was third highest or higher than all but 3. We're the 8th highest in the country in teacher pay. I think one issue that we need to address is, after the collective bargaining reform, there was a perception, and a lot of times perception is reality, that we don't care about our education professionals, that we don't value education. And I think the numbers don't back that up, but like I said, perception is reality. We need to do a better job of explaining to people that we want the best and brightest educators to stay in Iowa. We value our teachers, that education is a priority. It's 45% of our state budget, and I think it should stay that way. I'm not advocating for reducing that, but people need to understand that we really do value education in Iowa. And I do think that we need to make additional investments going forward, but there's a lot of other issues that go into education, and I think we addressed a lot of things as far as giving more tools and flexibility to our school districts. One of the first bills that I worked on allowed mental health professionals, I don't know if it was the second bill I floor managed, allowed mental health professionals to be shared within districts, where if you have a district like Westwood or Lawton Bronson in my district that maybe can't hire a licensed independent social worker or a psychologist in their school, and there's certain services they need that the guidance counselor can't provide, that they can partner with another school district, and that they actually receive incentives from the state, where they receive a boost of 5 students, so basically equivalent of $35,000, $38,000. So essentially they're allowed into this program that currently is being used for, I think, guidance counselors and superintendents, and there's some other things that allow schools to get sort of a benefit from the state if they're sharing services. But it opens that up for mental health professionals, because you shouldn't have a situation where mental health is a barrier to learning for any student. So I think there was a lot of things we did with that, with school safety, with giving the school districts flexibility to use money from some funds in other areas. So I think a lot of that goes into it, in addition to just the 1%. And that was honestly part of the deal, was because we're doing 1% this year, we're going to give you flexibility in other areas.
You mentioned the collective bargaining bill. You weren't in the legislature when that was passed in 2017, but do you feel that was overall a good bill or a bad bill for the state?
It isn't. If I wrote it, I wouldn't have written it that way. Kind of similar to the MCOs, I feel like it was something that needed to be done. You saw me just as a layman, and again, it's hard to analyze things when you're not there getting that information, and I'm not going to cast blame on people that voted for or against it, but just sort of as a layman, you always saw whenever something would go to arbitration, it always, came down in favor of the worker, the person filing the claim, and so it seemed like there was an unfair system, and so I think something had to be done. It was out of balance, exactly. So I think something had to be done. I think that there were maybe some areas where it was punitive. My view, and honestly, in that area, the number one question that I get is not necessarily with the collective bargaining, but when I knock on doors, people want to know why can't they have their union dues taken out of their paycheck, and would I vote to reinstate that? That seems to be the biggest burden on most people, at least what I'm talking to when I talk to their doors. And my view is that really should be and always should have been a decision left up to the school district. I honestly believe that it probably started not from a way where they're trying to be mean, but there probably were some school districts that said this is a burden, this is a cost, we can't do this in a really small school district. But for some place like Sioux City, I'm sure that they're probably deducting multiple things from people's paychecks, and that would be one thing that they could add to it that wouldn't create an extra burden to them at all. So I think that it should be up to the school district to decide. And I think that the employees need to understand that this is a service that they were providing, but if the school district wants to provide that service, I think they should be allowed to.
So if there were proposals that would address some of what you call perhaps punitive aspects of that bill, you would be open to discussion of those,
Yeah.
as opposed to just ditching that 2017 bill entirely.
Yeah, and I don't know if they necessarily, I don't think the intentions at all were to be punitive or mean, but I think that there's a perception, and I think that a lot of that is, perception is reality, and right now you have this perception that Republicans wanted to punish.
Anti-public sector.
Yeah, and we're anti, and so I think we need to go out of our way to make them aware that, okay, some changes had to be done, we did our best to hold you harmless, we think that going forward, you're going to be fine. I don't think you're going to see reductions in teacher pay. I don't think you're going to have any school district that's going to try to reduce or do away with health benefits. But I can understand how there's, concern. But I think we need to make it clear that we want the best and brightest to go into education. We want you to stay in Iowa. I believe that Iowa is the best place for people to teach. I honestly believe that if people leave Iowa, they go to Nebraska, they go to Minnesota, they're going to be disappointed and they're going to want to come back. But I think right now the perception is different than that.
Okay, you were part of this passage of this bill, and that's the tax cuts bill.
Mm-hmm.
Why is that a good bill for the state of Iowa?
So that was my big issue in my campaign, and I joked a couple days ago that I hope I didn't vote myself out of a job, but when I was knocking on doors in January, it struck me very clearly. It was 5 below. I was in a neighborhood, I think off of Kateri Way down by the mall, and 2 houses in a row, I had people very sort of unequivocally tell me that they were either going to move to Dakota Dunes as soon as their wife retired because their youngest daughter just graduated from East High, and the next house said that they were currently looking at houses in Dakota Dunes. And so I think that we need a representative who understands the border issues and can articulate those in Des Moines, because it seems clear and kind of second nature to us. But when you get to Des Moines, there are people who will say, oh, I've never had a person tell me that they were going to move out of state because of taxes. Well, if you're living in Bondurant, it's a lot harder, and people do move for taxes. Obviously, you see people leaving New York and moving to Texas, or leaving Pennsylvania, moving to Arizona. But to find a new job, uproot your family, now you're away from your family, you're away from your friends. And I think a lot of times in Des Moines they don't understand. You can move 2 miles down the road and you have your same church, you're just as close to your kids, you can still, maybe your office is 3 miles this way instead of 5 miles that way. Nothing changes except the taxes. And so something had to be done. The other issue I was passionate about, and I was happy that became part of the final bill, was it's not just about a reduction in rates. Even if it was revenue neutral, we just needed the perception that we were competitive with South Dakota. And so I think simplifying the number of rates is key, where they're going down to a top rate of 6%, doing away with federal deductibility. I know there's a lot of Republicans that approached me before the vote that said that they liked federal deductibility, they didn't want to do away with it. But the truth was, when people are coming to this area, I had a lot of people that told me, yeah, but Iowa has 9% top tax rate and South Dakota has 0. And if you try to explain to them, well, it's really about 7.5 or 7.25, when you factor in federal deductibility, their eyes glaze over and they stop listening to you. So I think that was a key. And also what that did, the amount of money that the state spent on the federal deductibility could be rolled into paying for the tax bill. And so that was something that was key for me, and I think a lot of other Republicans, that we wanted to make sure that this was responsible, that it was something that where you're paying for it primarily with the money from federal deductibility, the increased money, and I think that's a big part of the increase in revenues that we've seen in the state, is that now people have lower federal taxes because of the federal tax reform bill, so they're paying less in federal taxes, so they actually have less of a deduction in their state taxes, so they're going to pay more in state taxes. So it makes sense that we have increased revenue. So I think it's not fair for the state to hang on to that, and part of this idea was giving that back to people. And at the process, making places like Sioux City a lot more competitive.
One criticism is that it's too weighted toward affluent Iowans, those who need a tax cut the least, and to corporations.
I don't see that. I know that that's a talking point, with a lot of tax reform bills. I know that we had a lot of effort in, and I think that a big part of the reducing the brackets was to accomplish that. And another issue was with the top bracket. Right now, and I don't know the exact number, but it doesn't take a whole lot to get into the top bracket. We raised that, so now it takes a lot more to get into that 6%. So I think it will help middle-class families because they're going to stay in those lower brackets.
The corporate part of it, that there's too much tax relief provided to corporations.
Well, and I would kind of unequivocally disagree with that. I think they felt like that they had to do something on the corporate side for perception-wise. But again, when you're talking about the corporate tax rates, we were at about 12, or we had 11.99, or we were at 12. We were the highest in the country. The second highest was 9.99, I think it was, or 9.98 was Pennsylvania. So we were so twofold. I think they wanted to do away with the federal deductibility, so they said with federal deductibility, Iowa was really more about 10. So we were ahead of Pennsylvania, but it was close. So I think one, they wanted to change the perception by doing away with federal deductibility, and two, they wanted to have us not be the highest in the country anymore. So we went or we will, if all of the triggers are met, go to 9.98, which one makes us look better in comparison to Nebraska. I think is about 6.5. South Dakota is a 0, and two, people can't claim we're the highest in the country anymore. But really, there was a lot of push by some people to not address corporate at all, and so we did corporate in a sense that was essentially revenue neutral. There wasn't a whole lot of cut there. So I think for people to say the majority of this is going to corporations is just not true. I do think that there will be a push in the future to try to address that if revenues continue to grow, if it's responsible. And that was something that was a key for me is there's a ideological philosophy of some people where we just need to lower taxes, and then if the state has less money, then they'll have to cut spending. And my view is that I don't want to put us in a situation where we have to deappropriate, we have to cut services that we want and need because we don't have the revenue. So I think we need to wait, and if 5-10 years down the road, the state of Iowa is in a position where we can afford that. I had a conversation with a realtor in town who works with Sioux City and South Dakota, setting up businesses, selling franchises. And so he was talking about, from a sales perspective, that Sioux City in particular has so many more things to sell that it doesn't have to be 0 corporate tax rate like South Dakota, because you have the supply chain over here, the workers are over here, the people live here, the customers are over here. So he said it doesn't have to get to 0, it just has to be lower than what it is, because right now South Dakota's winning. So I just went on a limb and I said, okay, well, where do you think the tipping point is? Where does that need to get to? And without really even thinking, he said 8%. He said I could sell 8% all day, every day. So I think I would like a goal of at some point getting to that point, when the state of Iowa can afford it. Because what I noticed, as a kid growing up, you start hearing about people moving to Dakota Dunes and escaping taxes and other reasons. And then, as in college or maybe 10, 15 years ago, you start seeing some smaller businesses, State Farm, financial advisor going to the Dunes. And my wife works for Hedges Conner Williams CPA firm. They just moved their headquarters to the Dunes. United Real Estate commercial side moved to the Dunes. You're starting to see some bigger companies move to the Dunes, and I'm worried that if we don't stop the bleeding, it's only a matter of time before the Johnstown Popcorns or the bigger companies start moving to the Dunes. So I do think that it's having an impact, and I don't think anybody is advocating for Kansas-style irresponsible cuts or trying to go to 0. We just need to get to a point where we're competitive, because we do have a lot of things that are beneficial over here on the Sioux City side. And so I think, like the realtor from Sioux City suggested, I think at 8% we can be very, very competitive. So I don't know if that is something that will come up next year, but I think it's something that needs to be addressed eventually, because it's an area where it unduly impacts places like Sioux City. Because when you talk about, competing with Illinois, competing with Minnesota, even Missouri, there's not that pressure like I think we feel over here with South Dakota.
Absolutely.
10 minutes.
Okay, this next question is somewhat related in terms of competitiveness, and that is economic development incentives by the state. That's another area of criticism, that the state spends too much or perhaps doesn't spend those dollars wisely. The Apple project gets a lot of attention and discussion, $200 million in local and state tax credits for 50 jobs. Overall, just kind of give us an assessment, your viewpoint on how the state does in terms of how much it spends and how it spends those dollars.
I think it's really all over the place. So I've heard there's some research and development tax credit pays for itself, brings in revenue to the state. There's some obviously that don't. I've had discussions with Debbie Durham from Sioux City. I would really like to be a part of a conversation I think that they're going to have next year with the Department of Economic Development, where they kind of put all the tax credits on the table and determine what works and what isn't. An example of that would be the Targeted Jobs Program, which I worked very hard in getting extended for a year, because if you do have this analysis a year from now, if Targeted Jobs wasn't extended, it's not even going to be part of that discussion. It's gone. So we were able to get that extended for a year, and most of my view on that, and I've discussed with Debbie Durham, is this is a pilot program that has been extended beyond what it was intended to, and it's specific for certain border communities in the state. She would like to see that extended statewide. Obviously the price tag goes up. Right now it's used for retention of jobs and new jobs. She believes that there isn't the bang for the buck with the retention as much as the new jobs, or at least you don't know if it's working. A lot of times people say, okay, we're retaining 2,000 jobs, would those 2,000 jobs really have gone away? It's hard to tell. So that's an example of one where I think you could reform it, keep the program, pare it down a little bit, make sure that it's working a little bit more efficiently. It would be a much lower price tag for the state. And I think with most tax credits there's that way, where you really need to look at them. Like, for example, a colleague of mine from Muscatine was talking about the research and development tax credit, and he was talking about how if you look at this money spent here and the amount of money it brought in, that we actually were making money. I think that's an analysis that needs to be had for every tax credit. And for a lot of those, like I mentioned, the job retention portion of targeted jobs, if it's something where you're saying, I think this is happening, we're keeping these jobs, I don't know if they would have gone away, and if it's something where you can't quantify, then maybe that's
not a strong argument.
Yeah, that's not a strong argument.
What about the quality of the jobs? The jobs that are of a certain standard, so that they're not having to have a second job to...
That's absolutely a part of it. And I know there's a program called Quality Jobs, and with targeted jobs too. To qualify for the program, you have to meet a certain, it's $45,000 a year or whatever that threshold is. And I think that that's something, maybe instead of doing away with some of the tax credits, raising that threshold, where we'll just say, we will give you this, but only in the jobs over $60,000 a year, not
I think one of the misleading figures that we hear in our state is the low unemployment. Because I think a lot of times that figure also includes people who are doing more than one job. And it's not necessarily a job that has benefits or gives you enough hours so that it's considered a full-time job. So is there a way to solve that somehow, that we can look at careers for people, not necessarily just a quick job that will pay the rent?
Well, I think, and I'm hopeful that we help to address that in some ways with the governor's Future Ready Iowa proposal. The idea for that, and I think you need to be specific in the careers too, and making sure that they're good careers, but I think the idea behind that is that the state will identify careers that are in need. And I think we need to make sure before we're investing money in those. But if the state says, for example, construction, welding, and nursing, that if you go to a community college and you get your federal assistance, your state assistance, and your scholarships, that then whatever's left over, the state will pay for it to help you get that degree. And so I think that needs to factor into it of, we're not necessarily, even if there's a demand for retail, we're not going to help you go to school or training that's going to get you into that area. We're only going to invest in the areas like nursing, welding, where you're going to have high paid careers. And I think that there probably needs to be an attachment to that, of a commitment to stay in Iowa or work for for a year or whatever that requirement is. But I think that needs to be part of the discussion of not only are these needed jobs, but these are jobs that can sustain a person. So I think that is a big part of it. If you have a person that's working 2 retail jobs and you can train them for free and they can get a job as a welder making $80,000 a year, obviously their life is better, they're contributing more to the economy and society. So I think that is a key proponent. And something that I advocated for and I was very happy about was giving a little bit of local flexibility to the community colleges, where I believe, and I don't remember the exact numbers, but there are so many slots that the state's going to decide, and then there are a couple of slots that the local community college gets to say, maybe this isn't an area nationwide, statewide where there's a need, but in Siouxland,
Sure.
culinary arts, for example, they would say we have a need for that because of the casino here and a lot of other things. So I think that was important that you give that local control, because I think the community college and the school district and other people in this area understand maybe
What the needs
those
are.
Yeah.
What,
4 minutes.
What local priorities, if you get a full term, would you seek to champion in the next session? What priorities do constituents, local leaders talk to you about and say, we really want you to be a champion for this down at Des Moines?
The big thing is just those border issues. Targeted jobs, things that help Sioux City compete with South Dakota, Nebraska, recruiting businesses here. The tax reform was huge. Like I said, when I ran in January, that was by far the #1 issue that I heard. And so it was interesting when we were in a subcommittee meeting and there was a couple other representatives that were saying, I've never had a constituent ask me for tax reform before. And I would say, that was by far the #1 issue. I think just because, like I said, the people that are saying, I'm going to look for a house in Dakota Dunes and my retirement, I can basically get a raise in my retirement income. The other thing I hear a lot about is workforce, and I've started working with Wellswood Bunny and the local community-based corrections here in trying to devise a system where we can help people coming out of prisons get jobs in areas where they're greatly needed, and I think that helps too with reducing recidivism. I was sitting in a meeting, I'm on the Justice Systems Appropriations Budget Sub, and they were talking about how the recidivism rates were increasing, and a lot of times when people are coming out of prison, they have to send them back to their home, even though it's maybe not a good environment, because if they're going to have a job, maybe they don't have a car, they have to move in with their aunt because she's going to take them to work. Whereas if they could have a place where, if, for example, if an employer would help them find an apartment, provide transportation to work, could kind of be that support system, you wouldn't have to send them back into that environment that created some of the problems in the first place. So I think there's some places where we need to start to think outside of the box for the workforce. And I think employers for the first time now are willing to, where it was really easy for employers before to say, we just aren't going to hire ex-convicts. Whereas now I think because they're rethinking that because they have a need for workers. So I think it's a kind of a key situation and an opportunity for us to participate in that.
Move to the wrap-up questions, and I'll kind of combine 2 into 1 and give you a chance to talk about what you think are your greatest personal attributes that you bring to the position of state legislator, and why you are the best choice in this race for Iowa House.
The reason I kind of got into politics when I was in college, I was a math and business major, and I was really drawn to economics, and one of the reasons I wanted to run for office is I view myself as a problem solver, and there's so many times I've been in issues where the two sides are arguing with each other, and I can look at it and go, there is middle ground here, and I don't understand why they can't find that. And so on a lot of issues, whether it was the Targeted Jobs Program, the Save Penny, we passed the House, I was able to be a part of that negotiation on. There's a lot of situations where there's middle ground, there's a problem to be solved, and I feel like I'm good at that, and I want to continue to be a part of that. Because it benefits the people here, in Sioux City, whether it's people having issues with the Department of Revenue. Sometimes it requires legislative action, sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes you just need to put them in touch with the department and make sure they're doing what it's supposed to be doing. And that's something I really learned, from my position in Senator Grassie's office, is you come in and people have problems and you need to figure out how to make sure government's working the way it's supposed to.
Well, thank you for your time this morning. We appreciate it.
Thank you guys very much.